My name is Nelson DeMille, your host for the History of Air Combat. I became interested in the history of military aviation when I first flew into battle in Vietnam aboard Army Huey choppers, and as an author I have researched many areas of this fascinating subject, which have become part of my best-selling novels. I am proud to present this extensive video History of Air Combat, produced in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the United States Air Force. The following episode is America Unprepared, World War II Begins. Here's a dramatic story of the start of the greatest event of the 20th century, the Second World War, covering the period 1939 through 1941. The trigger was the invasion of Poland by Hitler's Luftwaffe and armored forces, which drew the British and French into the deadly conflict. Although America was not yet involved, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared a national emergency and stepped up aircraft production. With the war raging in Europe for 2 years, the Japanese suddenly bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, bringing the USA headlong into the fray.
1939. The United States, shocked by appeasement at Munich, had her leaders take a closer look at military aviation. While exploring the values of small bombers like the B-18 against the more costly Flying Fortress, they approved experimental projects for the B-15, whose 4 engines proved too weak for the giant's weight and wingspan of 149 feet, and for the lumbering B-19, which boasted a record span of 212 feet. However, both new ships did pay dividends in future bomber development.
It finally took world events to give the U.S. Air Force its biggest shot in the arm. On the fateful dawn of September 1st, 1939, Hitler directed the German Army and Luftwaffe in a lightning-like campaign. The map was Poland. The plan was surprise. 20 years before, President Wilson had warned us that any future war will inevitably open with great aerial activity. Wilson was right. Without warning, 2,000 modern German combat planes took off for the first aerial blitz in the history of the world. Poland died on its air. With this earth-shattering overture played by strafing Stuka bombers, World War II began. Ironically, the method the Germans followed in this Polish campaign was the same one by which we, on a far larger scale, would defeat Germany. As thousands of bombs demolished Polish cities, the U.S. Air Corps learned a lesson. Now Hitler's threat, today Germany, tomorrow the world, was both believed and feared.
In the United States, the President proclaimed a national emergency.
We immediately put a huge expansion program into operation. It took no time at all before we ran out of facilities, as we raised air crew and other training goals. From an all-volunteer corps of 23,000 in 1939, we grew 100-fold as more volunteers and draftees joined up. Science helped us choose their specialties. There were physical as well as mental requirements for the hundreds of skills which we eventually taught to 2.5 million men and women who became our ground and air crew. We measured a man's oxygen needs as well as his muscular and mental coordination. We devised mechanical aptitude tests and general classification tests which indicated ability to learn in the many technical categories. As General Arnold declared, the Air Corps had to become the largest single educational organization in a very short time. We were an army of specialists. In schools all over the country, we learned our trades from experts and became airplane mechanics, cooks and bakers, communications men, bombardiers, armorers, meteorologists. We learned hundreds of technical jobs, and finally we were a tremendous team of skilled Americans who knew how to keep them flying.
America's ability to mass-produce complex military aircraft was essentially a civilian miracle. However, in 1940, as in 1917, defense work didn't get started until late. War had stopped the wheels of industry, and conversion took time, valuable time. Many factors made the miracle possible. Waiting airplane designs, inexhaustible raw materials and highly adaptable industry, a variety of well-established aviation companies, willing defense workers, and a goal.
I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year.
Many said this was impossible, but the new models were ready. B-25 Mitchell by North American. T-38 Lightning by Lockheed. B-26 Marauder by Martin. T-39 Air Cobra by Bell. B-24 Liberator by Consolidated. And P-40 Kitty Hawk by Curtiss. But 50,000 aircraft meant speeding up from 2,000 planes a year to more than 4,000 planes per month. Could America do it?
When German forces, led by her Luftwaffe, began to overrun the map of Europe early in 1940, across Denmark and Norway, then southward, speeding over Holland and Belgium toward France, I, as a military observer, filed my report. The air war that everyone feared had, in fact, started. The smirking Luftwaffe was repeating its Polish success as it paved the way for advancing panzers which crushed 3.5 million French soldiers. While German troops and airmen goose-stepped on the heart of Paris, the Luftwaffe was invincible. But the triumphs of 1939 and 40 had all been scored against weak opposition. After the French surrender June 22nd, only the RAF remained for the Luftwaffe to conquer. A test of strength soon came, the battle for Britain. The Luftwaffe set to its task of controlling all Western Europe by crossing the Channel. German engines forecast a reign of death. The RAF was ready but outnumbered. Warned of the approaching attack, their fighter command sprang to the task of trying to hold off the invasion. While Britain's spotters and warning centers tracked the enemy planes, I watched the island's defenses go into action. The outnumbered few fought back with more than blood, sweat, and tears. They had Spitfires and Hurricanes in their aircraft arsenal, and a modest but well-trained force of airmen. The best that Goering had to offer was knocked out of the sky. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered 2-1, fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill and chased them back across the Channel. Then Britain's warning centers reported that Goering switched to night raids. London was still the main target, but the people had learned to take it. Although slowed down by ground and air defenses, the Luftwaffe's final effort was desperate. Her repeated night raids on southern ports and shipping were furious, but Britain was saved.
Out of the London Blitz came new cooperation with friendly nations for U.S. air defense. The President revealed an agreement transferring 50 overage destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for the right to establish air and naval bases at 8 key points. We received 99-year leases on sites in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Antigua, Trinidad, and British Guiana. For bases such as these, late in 1941, Army engineers began to practice building airfields in a hurry, a job they eventually did all around the world. At the Louisiana and Carolina maneuvers, steel carpets for airplanes were tried with excellent results. Air leaders called these landing mats the year's greatest achievement in aviation. Rivalry between Air Commanders William Kepner and Asa Duncan was keen, and every effort was made to simulate actual war conditions as they existed in Europe at the moment. Except that Hitler didn't use sacks of flour. High point of the maneuver was the lesson learned from the first large-scale use of American airplanes to move armies. On November 22nd, the fleet of C-47s unloaded a complete battalion of airborne infantry to help capture Pope Field, North Carolina. In the sham battle that followed, all the new planes distinguished themselves. Attesting to the gains made during the years of experimental technical advance, expanding man and machine power, the nation's air arm was being prepared for grueling events now only days ahead.
December 6, 1941, Honolulu. Although alerted, the city went about its business in the usual way. December 6, 1941, Hamilton Field, California. We were under orders to get every available B-17 to the Philippine Islands. General Arnold personally inspected the air movement of the 13 B-17s. They carried no armament because of the heavy gas load necessary for the 3,000-mile hop to Oahu.
Dawn, December 7, 1941, the Pacific Ocean. A Japanese task force was also heading for Oahu. Mission, sneak attack. Primary targets, Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field. Exactly at 0600, the fateful signal was given. And the first wave, 200 fighters, horizontal bombers, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers roared off. Pearl was an ideal target because through greater fear of sabotage than air attack, ships and planes had been brought together rather than dispersed.
When the B-17s from California finally approached the island, their engines were heard by some of our men at Pearl and Hickam. At the same instant, from another direction, the Japs struck. In the midst of the onslaught, the unarmed B-17s arrived. Our pilots could do no more than find a place to land.
Wave after wave of enemy planes bombed American aircraft and units of the Pacific Fleet in a treacherous attack which achieved perfect tactical surprise.
Other Japs went after U.S. fighters on auxiliary fields. In spite of the terrific pounding, our pilots and mechanics were able to get 4 P-40s and 2 P-36s in the air within the first 30 minutes and offer some resistance. In the face of overwhelming odds, Lieutenants Harry Brown, Robert Rogers, Kenneth Taylor, John Webster, and George Welch, among many others, fought back as best they could. At the end of the single air attack, the United States had suffered a crushing blow, and the nation was at war.
The Jap squadrons returned to their carriers with a loss of only 49 planes, a cheap price for so great a victory. Although America had paid heavily for being unprepared, the U.S. Air Force, led by men like Hap Arnold, began to rise from the disaster.
We are faced with a tough job, but I know that we can do it. And with all due reverence, I say, by God, we will do it.
Unprepared for the sneak attack, and now with its Pacific Fleet practically destroyed and airfields and aircraft knocked out, America buckled down.
1941. 24 hours after the date that will live in infamy, the nation assembled to hear their commander-in-chief.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
bombs from enemy planes had finally brought national unity. Fortunately, to lead the war effort, we had men like Mr. Robert Lovett, Assistant Secretary of War for Air, Judge Robert Patterson, Under-Secretary of War, Chief of the Army Air Forces, General Henry Arnold, heading a staff which included Carl Spaatz, James Doolittle, Ira Aker, and Hoyt Vandenberg, among others. And one of America's leading advocates for expanded air power, Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He checked U.S. outposts like General Frank Andrews' Caribbean Defense Command. In charge of Army forces in the Far East was the man who had helped us establish the GHQ Air Force, General Douglas MacArthur. Now he consulted with Manuel Quezon, President of the Philippines. Together they had kept the island secure after a week of heavy bombing by the Japanese. Mac's men, close to a knockout, rolled with a punch.
Not so at Clark Field. Here, despite a 9-hour warning, half our total bombing force was lost on the ground. But this didn't stop the Far East Air Force on emergency fields from wiring its planes together to fight what was destined to be a losing battle. Fighter pilots like Joseph Moore, Grant Mahoney, and Samuel Merritt fought a delaying action. Never knowing if their temporary bases would be safe for return, they prepared to engage the enemy. A few B-17s that escaped destruction joined the fight. Distinguishing themselves were bomber pilots Rosie O'Donnell, Hewitt Wheelis, and Kelly. That's Captain Colin Kelly. His fortress had been directed to locate and sink a carrier. Instead, a Jap heavy cruiser was spotted. A warship made a good target for Kelly's bombardier, Meyer 11. Bombs damaged and stopped the warship.
Colin Kelly's life came to a hero's end that morning. Meyer 11's luck ran out over New Guinea a year later. And despite the heroic sacrifices of men like Kelly and Levin, the Japs finally drove the Allies out of the Philippines. In Australia, where we had to concentrate our limited air strength after retreating from the islands, our job was to stop the Japs from sweeping over all the Pacific. With this in mind, we had to deploy our forces for the defense of Australia early in 1942. That's why General Ralph Royce, Chief of Pacific Air Staff, piloted his new boss, General George Brett, Chief of Allied Air Forces in the Pacific, on an aerial inspection tour. General Brett decided his air units must encompass the entire continent of Australia.
All this time, there was an American volunteer group in Asia. Here, Special Advisor to the Chinese Air Force, Claire Chennault, had 84 volunteer pilots, including men such as Tex Hill, George Burgard, and Robert Smith. Nicknamed the Flying Tigers, their P-40 Tomahawks were serviced by Chinese mechanics and 200 American ground crewmen. Along with official sanction, the former Army, Navy, and Marine pilots were offered $600 per month and the promise of a bonus for every Jap plane destroyed. A few days after Pearl Harbor, the Flying Tiger 1st and 2nd Squadrons moved to Kunming. There, Chennault set up a fighter control headquarters, hooked into an elaborate air warning net to receive reports from Chinese aircraft spotters. The Japanese, based at Hanoi, 60 miles away, headed for Kunming to destroy the untried Tigers who had arrived only the day before. The moment the jet flight was airborne, a sharp-eyed Chinese spotter ran to flash the warning. Crude red lantern semaphores sent the signal over the hill. Kunming had experienced many false alerts, but this report of heavy engine noise at station X-10 was the real thing. Fighter control added up the enemy course and placed them 50 miles east of Kunming. This was the decisive moment. The Tigers weren't going to lose any planes on the ground. Kunming wasn't going to be another Pearl Harbor or Clark Field. Japs were about to feel the fight of these razor-teethed tiger sharks, terrifying emblem of the Flying Tigers. And so, American pilots in American planes, aided by a primitive Chinese warning system, were about to tackle a formation of the Imperial Japanese Air Force, which was then victoriously sweeping the Pacific skies. Part of the fate of China was riding in the P-40 cockpits as Robert Sandel's first squad made contact with the enemy. Losing 60% of their force in this one fight, the Japs never again tried to bomb Kunming. Chennault's handful of Flying Tigers were our only fighting airmen in China. And like the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I, they made us proud.
But for global war, we needed men, thousands of skilled men. Some had to become bombardiers and learn the intricacies of complex gadgets like the secret bomb sights. Working mock-ups, machine guns mounted on platforms and trucks, trained gunners to draw a bead on a flashing target. Then the training took to the skies. Behind each gun was a man, and behind each man was months of training. The lives of a crew were going to depend on the accuracy of the gunner. By February 1942, tail guns were filling the blind spot that lost us Colin Kelly. The Axis took 10 years to build their air forces. America had to do it in one, and at the same time hold off the enemy.
On the President's order, the bitter taste of war was returned to Japan. We fashioned a daring scheme to have the Hornet launch a force of bombers and strike at Tokyo from the sea. All the volunteers for this secret and hazardous job had been specially trained by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. While under destroyer escort, the 80 Tokyo Raiders held a deck ceremony with Japanese medals. Doolittle fastened one of these to a 500-pound bomb. The medals were going to be returned with interest. Lashed to the flight deck, the 16 B-25s had a rough voyage. Hoping to reach a takeoff point 450 miles from Japan, but ready to start in event of discovery, the crews kept fit. They were discovered. After avoiding 2 enemy patrol vessels, the task force realized they were sighted by a Japanese picket boat. The Hornet's escort promptly sank. Since secrecy had been compromised and fearing an alarm all over Japan, Doolittle, forced into the decision, ordered the planes to be launched. This was 800 instead of 450 miles from Tokyo, and 10 hours earlier than planned. In spite of the last-second change, preparations went according to rehearsal. Only 467 feet of clear deck faced Doolittle's lead ship. The rest barely had room in which to rev up, and the last plane hung precariously out over the stern of the Hornet. After the wind-up by the flight officer, Doolittle made his run down the plunging deck. With 100 feet to spare, he led the parade. Tension eased a little once the colonel was in the air. Crewmen cheered as one plane after another screamed down the swaying runway. In the excitement, this pilot started without lowering his flappers. His plane ran off the deck, dropped sharply, but expert piloting saved it. Launching fully loaded medium bombers had never been done before. When the decks of the flagship were cleared, Admiral Halsey signaled to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, Good luck, and God bless you.
Tokyo, oddly enough, had just completed an air raid drill. Their patrol boat had warned the city, but the attack was expected the next day. Therefore, the Jap war machine rolled on, unmindful of the approaching eagle. Target factories were turning out munitions tagged for Corregidor, Midway, and Dutch Harbor. Secure behind their Pacific fortress, and confident of an early victory, they discounted America's ability to fight back.
Thus, the bombers were virtually unopposed as they flew on the deck. They swept in over the coast on their way to Tokyo. Elements separated and some climbed to 1,500 feet for the bombing. At 12:15, the attack was opened by Doolittle, who dove in before he unloaded his incendiaries upon the Japanese capital. One after another, they checked off their targets. Tank factory, shipyard, docks, railroad yards, steel plant, gunpowder factory.
As the raiders left Tokyo with a broad trail of flame and smoke in their wake, Japan tasted war. The raid was but an omen of the eventual destruction to be heaped on Japan from the skies. As Doolittle later promised,
"We're going back to Tokyo, and we shall go in full array and with mighty allies."
The daring exploits of General Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers against the Japanese forces in China helped to build morale. So did Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's heroic B-25 bombing attack on Japan from the deck of the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier Hornet. With its sleeves rolled up, American industry quadrupled production, and by July 1942, our Navy soundly defeated the Imperial Japanese Navy in the decisive Battle of Midway.
Spring 1942. The Axis was winning the war, and the Allies faced their gravest crisis as Nazi and Japanese officers met in Germany. If their victories continued, and as yet there was no force to stop them, the Axis powers hoped their armies would victoriously meet in Asia, just as their tacticians met for maneuvers. Each greedy for immediate conquests, they planned to completely dominate the world. In those black days of 1942, German armies and air forces pushed toward Japan. Relentlessly, the gigantic Axis pincers were threatening to close in Central Asia.
That's why American industry doubled and quadrupled its war effort. There was definite hope for victory, provided the British and Russian people could give the United States time to supply our allies and time to build an air force which could smash the Axis pincers. It wasn't long, and the Truman Committee was able to state, "We have succeeded in building up an air industry in the U.S. which our foes cannot hope to equal."
But planes alone were not enough, and so specialized training began in 1942 under the watchful eye of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He saw the 82nd Airborne Flying Foot Soldiers change from a brave dream into a deadly fighting machine under command of General Matthew Ridgway. The 1st Air Troop Carrier Unit had been set up by the AAF to work with paratroopers. The amazing success of the Germans had awakened belated American interest in vertical envelopment, which means landing a combat force behind enemy lines. Reliable C-47s were quickly boarded by the shock troops who were going to spearhead the way for a glider army which would follow. They were about to test tactical principles in North Carolina before going overseas to help blunt the Axis pincers. For all the great airborne operations of the war, American troop carrier men and planes provided most of the lift. There was nothing new about an airborne army. Billy Mitchell had received approval for such an operation during World War I. But even he never dreamed of entire armies filling the skies. In theory, the American paratroopers dropped on surprise defenders and seized bridgeheads for the gliders.
On other airfields, towcraft, modified C-47 Skytrains hitched on troop carrier gliders which were loaded and ready. Nylon, the new strong synthetic, was science's answer to the tow rope problem. Once hooked together, the transport towed the glider into position for the takeoff run. This made room for another Skytrain. On a split-second schedule, they were like so many locomotives taking on freight cars. Some Skytrains hauled double freights. Taxiing at full throttle, the tow planes had to remain on the ground until the ton-and-a-half gliders were airborne. Once over the drop zone, glider pilots cut their ships loose to play their special part in the pattern of attack. Banking sharply away, they dove for the ground. Quickest possible landing kept the unarmed gliders from being easy game for enemy fighters. As more cut loose and headed down to the spinning earth, the glider army joined the paratroopers who had set up points of resistance. Thus, the AAF gave the infantry wings, and the weapon, vertical envelopment, became a reality.
Another weapon in America's arsenal for global war was the skill and experience of our great commercial airlines operating under contract to the War Department. July 1942, this ferrying service was reorganized as the Air Transport Command under veteran flyer General Harold George. In the company of C.R. Smith, his deputy, they inspected new installations. By summer, ATC routes touched all 6 continents. The growth of the Air Transport Command closely paralleled the expansion of the Air Force itself. In less than 2 years, sky bridges connected practically every corner of the world. ATC skywagons, guided by the Army Airways communication system, crossed the Atlantic on an average of 1 every 13 minutes, the broader Pacific every hour and a half. And so ATC, by supplying both men and machines to world battlefronts, was preparing to smash the Axis threat.
During these critical early days, the Navy succeeded in breaking the Japanese secret code. On May 15th, Navy intelligence officers intercepted an important communication. It was the detailed Jap plan to attack Midway and points in the Aleutians with an invasion army supported by a tremendous task force. But if the Japs knew that we had broken their code, this could have been a wild goose chase or a trap. The Army and Navy decided to gamble. If we could intercept the Jap Navy at Midway, the payoff was too great to overlook. And so the call went out. ATC had to deliver reinforcements, bombs and ammunition to the Aleutians and B-17s to Midway. The Hawaiian Department had to beg, borrow, and steal these bomber aircraft from our slim Pacific forces. The B-17s committed to this mission were led by Lieutenant Colonels Walter Sweeney and Brooke Allen. Every last plane would be needed for the impending battle. Once down on Midway after the long flight, with no rest, our crews had to be thrown into immediate patrol.
The Japanese fleet, more than 80 warships, advanced. The coded message was authentic. Their task forces divided, some steaming north toward Alaska, the main body converging on Midway. 470 miles west of the island, the battle stage was set when a Navy Catalina spotted the strong enemy task force. But Midway's commander refused to commit American naval or air units until he had more information about the enemy.
Our newly arrived B-17s and B-26s, as well as Marine fighters, were under constant alert. We installed extra gas tanks to increase bomber range. Our crewmen realized that this was going to be the first test of B-17s as a defensive weapon against attacking surface forces. Some big bomber boys even claimed that B-17s could stop carriers. The 4th of June was the day of the real battle. Minutes after a patrol sighted the enemy, those bombers not yet in the air got going fast. 9 B-17 crews under Colonel Sweeney were joined by 5 from Colonel Allen's squadron. Warmed up and ready for battle, Air Force bombers took off to find the enemy. Rendezvous point was Curie Island, from where our bombers were to proceed west to the target. 100 miles out, our bomber commanders received new orders to change course and go after an enemy carrier force that had broken away from the main fleet and was now launching an attack against our base.
The Japanese dagger, pointed at Midway, was made up of 4 carriers, great battle wagons, many destroyers and transports. The mission of the Imperial carrier planes was to rake the island's gun emplacements and bomb the way for an invasion. Marine Vindicators sprang to meet the enemy, and the battle was on.
In the heat of battle, our flag was struck down. Marines quickly repaired the broken staff and ceremoniously raised Old Glory against the backdrop of fire, smoke, and fate. Units of the U.S. Navy, including 3 flat tops, had raced up to Midway. Navy fighters and bombers were wound up and sent off while the Japs were still pounding U.S. defenses. Enemy destroyers and cruisers were the target. Our marauders and fortresses went after enemy carriers. Jap units were like huge magnets attracting Navy planes, Marine dive bombers, and AAF heavies. One B-17 found his target and leveled off. Jap units and American bombers joined the battle. This Jap Betty got through our barrage. It was a free-for-all. Finally, when our Navy and Air Force bombers hammered back at Jap carriers, the issue was decided. First, our bombers attacked from 3,600 feet and then came down to strafe the deck. One by one, the enemy ships caught fire. During the 3-day battle, aside from 8 auxiliary vessels sunk or damaged, Japan lost 4 carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 3 destroyers, in addition to 275 aircraft and 4,800 men. We had smashed the Jap dagger.
Back at the base, now free from the threat of invasion, the men dug themselves out of the wreckage. A Navy PBY, which had rescued a ditched B-17 crew, now brought them home. The battle ended with Midway's installations, including the hospital, badly wrecked by enemy bombers. Unified under one flag, sailors, Marines, and airmen who had fought side by side now saluted the 92 officers and 215 enlisted men we had lost. All were heroes. In the Battle of Midway, perhaps the most important single engagement of the Pacific Naval War, the airplane at last proved itself a defensive weapon against attacking surface forces. Once again, the AAF had demonstrated its ability to meet the enemy on land, on sea, and in the air. It was planned destiny that the Axis pincers would suffer the crushing blows of the greatest striking force in military history, the United States Air Force.
We have come to the end of another chapter in our video history of air combat. I look forward to joining you again for our next exciting presentation in this series.